1.5% from 3.5%, and also there are concessions as far as the 20% of disputed tax amount for cases filed at the Tax Appeals Tribunal is concerned, and also there are liability on insurance that has been scrapped off. And we continue pace with the conversation looking at that. We want to circle back with Professor, but before we do that, we can see also on the screen there a very interesting editorial cartoon. This is in the Star. Puzzle of the housing fund, as you can see, and that's the question also that we were being given the clarity by Bill Okero, that now that it's not a contribution, this is a Star, right? Now that it's not a contribution, it's a tax. It means also that this money that will be taxed from you will not be refunded, as it has been promised before by the government. So it is just going down the tubes as taxes, because taxes are not refunded if they're gotten from you. It's not really the VAT and all that also you try and claim. So the debate about housing, living, and now a housing tax, what will be the way forward? Let's maybe pick the brains of Professor Gituro Wanaina. We're to circle back with one. Maybe we can pick up on that particular cartoon as we continue. But let me go on with the cartoon. We finished with the cartoons as well. This is what we have also in the Daily Nation today. 4.45 trillion budget, and we can see him with a briefcase. It seems the briefcase is so large, larger than the CS himself.
Larger than life.
He's actually holding it up, larger than life, as you can see. Right? It gets bigger and bigger. And this is in the Star today. The Standard, we can see Arab Singh there and the DO. Arab Singh and the DO, that is the we can see there. What is happening? He says this bill will lead you through prosperity, the Finance Bill 2023, and around that particular UDA car is a mass, or skeletons actually, of livestock, mostly livestock. I don't know why he's picked up on livestock.
And I'm sure. No, most are skulls.
Eh?
They're skulls of people.
They're skulls of people?
Yeah,
oh yeah, they're skulls of people as well.
The left is all the skulls, yeah.
I see Moi there. And Jogida Singh or something. I'm not sure, Karasinga. What's the connection here?
You know it.
You don't know it? Oh. This is Arab Singh and the DO. Who's the DO? Who used to be a DO?
That's Moi.
No. It's your deputy president.
Oh, my. But this thing here is...
No.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All manner of interpretation.
Yeah, let me hear what. Yeah. So, Bill Okelo, what are you interpreting?
No, I think it's what I've said earlier. What this cartoon portrays is a government of UDA that disregards, that's the way I'm seeing it. I mean, it disregarded the situation, the lives of the people, and they're simply saying, look, we'll lead you to prosperity, but the reality is people are suffering, people are dying. You can see skeletons, animals, in a situation where people are, suffering, and you are pledging that, the future is going to be
prosperous.
This is a dichotomy in the...
Yeah. This is where now I wanted to ask Prof, what will President Moi, or former President Moi, be doing on a UDA convoy or a car, for that matter?
What is the Singh doing there? Who is this Singh? But I can get what Bill is saying. You are like, everything is okay in a sea of mess.
Correct.
That one I get, with all these, the bodies and or something like that. I'm not quite sure the two people on top of the car there.
All right.
Yeah. But
you go and do your homework.
Maybe next time these guys are some steps ahead of us.
When you see Arab Singh and the deal, you know what it really depicts as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Arab Singh, if you can follow the story, it began with the story of Western Hotel, right? That's where Arab Singh
Oh, okay. Okay. I get it now.
I came to the fore as well. Okay.
But the point I was trying to make here earlier on with my friend, and I asked Mheshimiwa here, unpack those things. And if I were to look in the current, in a very simplistic way, in the budget, I'll unpack the deficit. It's one item as a government you really have to, because it's a commitment here. A commitment that I borrow, you pay back. So look at that. Secondly, I'll look at my recurrent budget. And in any institution, if your recurrent is going up, then you need to step back and ask yourself, am I using the right skills? Am I leveraging where I can have people producing more? Each year, if you look at the recurrent, and when you're talking about the deficit, if I step back a bit, how do I export more? And I'll give this example. I was sharing last week here in Panari with the researchers through Kipra. If you step out of the highway, the car you see ahead of you is a Toyota, behind is Toyota, the side is a Toyota. What does that tell you? You go to your sitting room, you find an LG or Samsung, the microwave, the TV. Those countries are exporting. So they're making a surplus. And what does that translate? It goes back to Japan, it goes back to South Korea. If you look at, and I've said this before, the trucks are full of mizigo when they're coming from the port, but they have nothing when they are going back. Meaning, we're just importing. What does that do in terms of our resources? So when you look at that, how do we then, and I'm linking up, how do you now link the deficit, or how do you, but that's what you link up the recurrent and development. Development, as you look at this budget, is almost 50% below the recurrent. And you want to grow? Because we must invest in development to create wealth. How do we create wealth in a nation? By going to the productive sectors. How do you provide incentives? You provide this incentive at the production level, at the farmer, at the manufacturer, my bill here. That's where you target so that they can produce more. And then you can kick in terms of the taxation. So if you also look at budgets, how is it pure development? As I say, inclusive development these days and sustainable development. So that's how perhaps I was asking my friend, unpack those things you have to do. From my point of view, I would unpack those things.
Okay.
And I would say something like our deficit, something of a deficit in terms of how much we're paying and how much it's a pain point. The issue of the cut is a pain point. And I think Margaret was spot on. Yeah, she was spot on. She said, our biggest challenge you're having, look at how much go to just Teacher Service Commission. So we need to balance between our development and the current.
All right, I just wanted to go back to the issue that also is on the front page of the Star today, where we have State House. When we're talking about austerity measures as well, we have this report that State House spends, this is from the Control of Budgets, 8.5 million daily on hospitality. And this goes to hosting dignitaries and clerics, as the flagger is reading here as well. So when we're going to...
Or even saying, I don't go to these presidential ceremonies. You remember somebody was saying, and then some people picked it somewhere and say, it's a state function.
Let's hear from Dr. Shemo Chodha, especially on talking about austerity measures. And on this other side, we are actually spending extravagantly, as far as we can see on this. And this is just speaking from both sides of the mouth. So how do we trust that even the taxes that is being collected from Mwananchi will be spent prudently?
I think we agreed unanimously around the table that we have to tighten the belt. But government should have shown more prudence in terms of cost cutting. The actual austerity need not only be talked about, we needed to see it also being being realized. You know, when you still see a lot of splendor and you know, we are not behaving like a country that's in an economic quagmire. So in terms of cost cutting, it goes without saying that before we even think of increasing taxes, already Kenyans are overtaxed, if you ask me. The fact that companies are leaving this country, particularly countries that are in the manufacturing sector, I agree in that regard with both Professor and Senator here. A sector we needed to concentrate on is export. And manufacturing goes with that, of course, services as well. You know, our greatest export now is labor. So without gainsaying. So if there is anything we would do to encourage more export, to bring in more hard currency, much so the better. But in terms of 8.5 million shillings a day, you know, I don't really know what they've been spending before. But what I know for a fact, and it's already been explained around the table, that the highest consumers of our budget, apart from education, Office of the President, National Security, the National Treasury, and so on, I thought as a government that professors going digital, that you would expect that those expenditures go down. Right. If it's spending to collect revenue, digitize more, that reduces cost, increases efficiency. If it's gathering intelligence and all, go digital. Again, that should reduce cost, but we're not seeing that being realized. So that's why I'm a little bit in a quagmire, that while on the one hand, we're saying we're promoting digitization, we're not seeing the benefits being reflected in a budget that would be reduced. I know the tradition has been that, I don't remember instances when budgets have been reduced, but maybe that's where the Kenya Kwanza would have shown that if it's a pro-people government, the hustler government, that we're going to show in, not only in word, but also in deed, that we are cutting costs, we are tightening belts. You know, I really wish I could see a Kagame moment here when you say, or you get all these big fuel guzzlers from the cabinet secretaries, from the PSs, from the CEOs, from the chairpersons, you know, not just in one instance, but say as a government we are deciding we want to send a strong signal.
And you know what, shame? That budget of what you say down there is not extravagant.
True.
They will not require those 4-wheel drives.
Right.
They're simple. Simple.
Because
what they require.
Because the roads would be good anyway.
Right. I think
Is it Bunyasi Sako?
Yeah. Sorry, how much is 8.5 per year? Sorry.
Is it billion?
3.1
billion.
3.1 billion
now
on hospitality.
You see, that thing is misleading. That 8.5. Oh, it's only hospitality.
It's hospitality.
Okay.
3 point
hospitality.
billion.
Well,
The tea and the bread.
yeah, in the best of circumstances. You know,
Hosting the dignitaries and clerics, it says here.
Yeah, but a couple of things I have to say. First, I think that by one measure, if you look at our budget this year relative to last year, 3.3 trillion to 3.6 trillion, to equalize 3.3 trillion, if you simplify it with the exchange rates that have occurred, we ought to be about 3.8 trillion to equalize last year. So a lot of this is just light money in the air. However, of course, to do it accurately, there is an element of the 3.3 trillion that was entirely domestic expenditure, so it can only be adjusted by inflation. But the component that was, if you look at it from the point of view of exports, you could say, and that's why his point, Professor's point, what more can we keep doing in these export earning sectors to actually move up our revenue in tandem with the exchange rate changes that have occurred this last year. So there are other ways that we look at it. And it's a very small budget. Our budget is about, as it is now, with the exchange rate of about 139 to the dollar, just simplifying it for discussion purposes, it's only about 25 billion. 25 billion, I don't know what the budget of some of the American cities are like.
It's more than that.
We are not really in the sky, as it were. But the components of it and the distribution of this pain that we are carrying is the area around which I think we have a lot of concern. For me, what would be most crucial is, despite what has gone on and the discussions, and people have different views on this that we have had, if in the coming year there would be faithful implementation on the programs that are promised to be implemented. So we would say, oh, that was a painful one. Not just because we paid, but look at it has produced whatever these services might be. And Wananchi have the right to say, an analyst, that even though we realize those services, that's not what we really wanted something else. And governments that are going to face elections will begin to listen, will listen to it. We went into this thing with the question that a 3% housing levy will not change. It will be, suddenly we've ended up with some other animal at the negotiating table, 1.5, but of a completely different animal than we had thought. These things are dynamic. They don't set in stone in the way we are looking at it.
Chairman, sorry, not
Yes,
Chairman.
Yes,
Chairman
Well, you will chair something one of these days. Yeah, of course, you are chairing this table.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let me clarify one thing. I think the point raised about the State House expenditure is a very important one. I think the leaders should always lead by example. The total budget for State House in the previous government that just handed over power was 4.5 billion. This government now, the total State House budget is approximately 15 billion. It's gone up 3 times, 14.7 actually, both the president and the deputy combined. So you can see how dramatic the figures have gone up because of the lifestyles of the current presidency. Which does not really help in showing, frugality, the austerity that they have talked about. The second thing that I want to clarify is that when the finance bill was submitted, it was clearly intended to raise 210 billion. That's what they said. The total amount of revenue that would be generated by these revenue measures was 210. Now, yesterday, when the chairman was presenting in Parliament, he said the revised, after removing all those things, well, that's why I said they are cosmetics. He said now the total revenue that will be generated will be 311 billion. It's there in all the papers, you can see. So it's actually gone up. Despite the fact that they've told people, we have removed these things. But, it's actually, there'll be more revenue. But look at it this way. In the last 2 budgets, for example, in 2021, the total amount of taxes that was raised in that finance budget was only about 9 billion. Last year, when the situation was very bad, the maximum amount collected in the additional revenues in the taxes in the finance bill was around 50-something billion. We have not gone to a situation where in one finance bill, you are trying to generate 311 billion. This is why all these taxes are there. But I think more significantly, and that's almost 9% increase when you look at the thing which a lot of Kenyans miss is that what is our actual budget? It's not 3.6. It's 4.5. I mean, you saw it. You put it on the screen. It's on all the papers.
Oh yeah.
That's what I was
wondering.
What the government does is they always play down the debt repayment amount of about 886, I think 800 and something billion. But that is an expenditure that has to be paid. Loan redemptions is an expenditure. So the actual total expenditure that we need to finance this year is 4.5 approximately. And our total tax revenue, we said, is 2.5. Straight away, this will tell you that there'll be a 2 trillion that will have to be financed one way or the other. So they do debt rollovers. They don't announce these things, but what they really mean is that part of that debt
particularly the domestic
will be rolled over. So it will continue to be. So in effect, when you look at the numbers, there'll be no reduction in the debt because you actually renew most of those loans. So I think we have a budget that endorses one thing which we thought this government will really, because it was in their pledge, that they are not going to, or they are going to reduce the loans. But what is going to happen is that the loans are not going to reduce. That's a reality. The loans are not going to reduce. And if this budget was intended to win us off from the debt, the next one is going to tell you a different story. Yeah.
So Bunyasi thinks this is just a blip.
according to, you know, other states, even in the US, this is just a blip.
We aren't there here,
No,
we have to deal with our reality.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah, are we leaving our financial
But
truth?
in real terms, the actual increases are not that big. But it all depends on our own internal capacity here. But on the debt question, I'd like to comment very quickly. I think that this administration will have to focus on the debt issue squarely. On the domestic debt side, we have handled it by rolling over, as Bill was saying, by rolling over and only paying the interest on it. We've rarely paid down the domestic debt, and those who do lend to government don't have any interest in getting paid off. No, the rollover is just what they want, and now you pay whatever the new interest would be. So that has been. But however, the discussion around how are we going to reduce the debt service burden. The total debt can stay out there so long as the debt service is affordable. So that in the revenue collection, now they say it's about 60 shillings out of every 100 that we collect for revenue will go to debt payment. That leaves, in terms of what you can do, the own financing, only 40%. These are really rough numbers. And therefore you have to fill it up through borrowing, clearly. Borrowing would be there. Sustainable borrowing is the issue. Some people don't even believe there's such a thing as sustainable borrowing. But, you know, borrowing in a way that you can actually stay on the good side of your lenders and you don't... I heard the other day Mr. Njigi in one of the studios around here saying, oh, Kenya should default. Get out of this and start again. I thought that was tongue in cheek. But some people might believe it literally, as a senator from my county said, that we have already repaid our debts, and they didn't quite understand what that meant, and so on. I think he meant that if you considered genuine debt that we had, then our repayments have paid it. But if you consider all this other debt which has come with the baggage of corruption and so on, in terms of what he was saying, then we have some money that is still not paid out there, and we should not pay it, he was saying. Now all these are nuances on the margin. I think we need to get this economy to focus on sustainable management of debt, which would mean that that recommendation they would have on what should be in the basket of expenditure would have to be listened to. I was pushing for an independent authority to do that, but now they're trying to expand an office inside the Treasury to do that. They won't go anywhere with that kind of thing.
All right. I want just to get clarity, especially, let's hear from you, Dr. Shemo Ochodo, on the housing levy and the housing fund, because Bill has raised a very interesting angle onto it, that when it is labeled as tax, we have all manner of dynamics, you know, converging around the whole issue of the housing levy or the housing tax as it is. If all these promises have been given out, that after 7 years then you get your refund, that will not really happen. Then how then do we put our trust on this particular housing project that every Kenyan now is being pushed to, you know, consider?
Before that, there's this important point that Chairman Nancy was raising of us having overpaid debts, which I don't think we should gloss over. If it's true, as Senator Okiya Omtata claims, and I have no evidence to support,
Jimmy Wanjigi also claims,
and so does Jimmy Wanjigi, and I have no evidence to discount what they're saying or to support.
Right.
I mean, we're talking trillions. Why do we need to hustle and overtax Kenyans 300 billion extra, while we could easily trace the 1.5 trillion? So I really think government needs to be fair to us in this regard. This is probably where I may disagree with Senator Bilo. Maybe providing more resources to the governance structure, to the courts. If courts are going to deliver, if the justice system is going to work so that everybody is accountable, then it may be well worth spending a little more if we can recover that 1.5 trillion. Because then a lot of things we are haggling about will be sorted out. So, assuming it's there. But if it's not, let's get it also to be clear, so that it's not something that we say, as I've been hearing around the table, that everybody knows. And then if everybody knows and we're just comfortable about it, I think it worries me. But lastly, I was hoping that the Treasury, the CS, would indicate, we know that a major problem we are dealing with is the need to stabilize the Kenya shillings against the dollar. It has grown, I think, about 30%, if not more, over the past 1 year. So clearly, a lot of what we are paying for is due to our inability to sustain that level of foreign exchange. I would have wanted to hear more, what are we doing as a country, particularly the National Treasury, to stabilize the dollar? Because if it's going to be free fall, as some estimate it will go up to 150 shillings to the dollar, clearly that's like 50% of a big problem. In my view, I think we are addressing the symptoms rather than the real problem. So I think that's what I wanted to say. In terms of refunds, let me leave that to the expert.
All right, before we even go to the refunds on this issue of the debt, because we've had the debate that there's the approved debt and we have the unapproved date.
Right.
That has been accumulated, and people now are questioning this unapproved date that has to be passed through Parliament. Why will Kenyans be obligated to pay this unapproved debt? Because we are not obligated constitutionally to do it. I mean, that's how it should go. Take us through the dynamics before a country is engaged in any debts.
And when
you look at the constitution, it's very clear that the government cannot borrow except with the prior approval of Parliament. That's the law.
Right.
The practice, however, is that Treasury or the executive borrows and then gets an approval later from the government, from the Parliament. That's what happens. But which of course is failure by Parliament to really exercise their mandate fully. But the challenge about our debt has been for a long time the transparency around it. This question has been raised, for many years. We've been demanding that Treasury should allow for an external audit of our debt so that we know exactly what is our debt, who borrowed, for what purpose.
Exactly.
And all that.
Right.
But it's something that the government or the executive has always preferred to deal with in opacity, and they didn't want that. There is something about debt that you should know. You see, government itself sometimes finances or assists even institutions in the private sector to be funded through a loan. They provide sovereign guarantees quite a lot to institutions in the private sector. For example, in the power energy sector, it's very common. And these things mutate into a loan so that the government has to pay. A good example was during the Anglo leasing. You've seen how many of those loans ended up for the government to pay. So what is happening is that when we want figures on our loan, on our debt position, we sometimes have to, quite often, get to look at the World Bank and IMF to give us the figures. Even after the government has set up a debt office, a debt management department in Treasury, these figures, it has always been a moving figure that you cannot really, that's why you find during the campaigns, the current president saying his team was saying our debt is 11 trillion, and the former government was insisting it's 8 trillion.
It's a moving target.
So there is no transparency, both in terms of knowing the value of our debt and also in the manner in which the debt is being procured. Because I can tell you that for a fact, if you have a project, get Treasury to assist and there are many private sector led initiatives which enjoy the funding by through a loan. Quite often it's through guarantees, but in the past some of it has been directly lending actually by through Treasury and so forth, assistance of Treasury by through those institutions. So I think that's why you find when someone says some of these debts are not approved, what they mean is that these are debts that have not got express approval in Parliament, for example. And the way the Treasury prefers to submit for approval is always tricky. What they do is, in the printed estimates, they'll lump up all these dates at the back there, in the annexes up there, down there, so you cannot actually, unless you are smart, you can't see them. That's how Anglo leasing was discovered. It took before, a number of months, years later, before we discovered that these things were. You'll only see the repayment to company XYZ, Dibal, the due payment, this debt, $100 million. That's when you see what did the buyer say. Then that's when you start asking for the documents. But in reality, they are supposed to submit the documents for the loan, which is stating the term, the amount, the repayment, and everything, to Parliament for approval. They don't do it. But so there's a lot of questions regarding the integrity of our debt register. So and I think we need an audit really for us to determine exactly what is it and who borrowed and what is it for.
So why would we be obligated to pay if it's not been approved by Parliament?
Right. Yeah, let me just chip in to agree with him and add something else to it. Sure. What he said is spot on issues of lack of transparency, a moving loan book. When I was working on this bill I was talking about, it was difficult to get accurate figures. It always depended on whom you talk to. It's actually messier, just in the terms of the bookkeeping of it and so on. The bookkeeping of it, but sort of inside this shroud of opaqueness. And I don't even know if the presidents themselves are aware that it's that bad. And that's why I think getting that pried open will be very important. But on the issue of lack of transparency, Parliament is asleep on this issue. Because, for example, we have talked a lot about the debt, say some bilateral debt. We use the Chinese as an example, but it broadly speaking, it affects other countries as well. Where they're saying they haven't seen the full loan agreement. They only see parts of it. There's somebody in government who has it, but not Parliament. Parliament did not. I know that current Minister Murkomen started by saying everything will be laid bare, but he couldn't then get to do that. I think that's something that we really must tackle. And lastly, the Auditor General's office has a lot to do. I think one of the best Auditor Generals we had was Eddie Owuko. Perhaps didn't realize that. He had a serious international reputation. He knew what he was doing. And when he was chasing on the Eurobond thing, you remember when the president confronted him in some workshop, I don't know why the workshop was being done in State House. The president had wanted to be part of it, but he didn't want to have to travel to do it. And he saunters in, and he perches himself in a high stool in a corner, and sort of asks him, says, "So I hear you want to go to the New York Reserve Bank, for what?" And then Eddie Owuko is composed, and he sort of says, in accordance with the law, we have to get down to where the money came from, where the money may have gone, and so on. And our evidence shows that there's more information we could get from there. He sort of, firmly tried to stand his ground as you would be a head of state. Parliament hasn't moved on to tighten those things. The recruitment of the successor, as you remember, did not go smoothly. It was more like we need somebody who is more conforming. That was a very sad commentary about the person who finally got elected, appointed. Those are things we really must address. And in there, among the candidates, there was people who had serious experience, and would have met other criteria that they may have been looking for. You had Edward Owuko, you wanted somebody else different. There were people in there that could provide that difference and were competent. And then they were set aside. Then the thing was repeated. And then suddenly we end up, Lord behold. And now you don't see OAG's reports hitting the headlines much because there's a lot of self-gagging that goes on in there. I can say that with a high degree of confidence on this issue. So this issue of transparency is extremely important. And we know Kia and I don't know who the other guy was we mentioned.
Jimmy.
And Jimmy are talking about we have paid off our debt. They may be saying we have paid off amounts equivalent to the legitimate component of the debt. Anything above that was not a legitimate debt. But if a sovereign official has signed on it, you borrowed 100 and you have charged 200 to this country, that becomes the debt, unfortunately. But if you just want to know that in order to be able to squeeze certain, I think we should go ahead and do that. But we must do something about it.
So the question is, and that's why would we be obligated to pay for these debts which are not legitimate?
Sure.
No, but you've signed on. I mean, if there's one country I want to mention the name, which said
we've signed on. And I think this is where Parliament needs to step in, because we have Bill saying, sometimes what the executive does is that they go full steam ahead in getting into this debt without the approval of Parliament.
But
then they do it afterwards. And I think that was also on the debate of the Treasury, the telecom deal.
that it didn't get approval from Parliament, and then afterwards we're told, oh, it came thereafter because of issues of emergency and urgency.
Yeah, those are all games and gimmicks. Sorry, I don't want to.
Just.
But I was just going to say that if we truly want to deal with this issue of transparency, we're not going to deal with it only in terms of foreign transactions. Domestically, why should a contract that ought to be, let's say, 100 billion be funded at 200 billion internally, for example? We see it, but we are not able to investigate this and say this what happened. Therefore, this padding that occurred was to benefit such people or such group. And we know that it can't be done, but it's not looked at. So we shouldn't only make the noise when it's a foreign debt. Of course, it's worse when it's foreign. But one country said, we funded what the request from your government was. What actually it cost is not our business. Go ask them. What does that mean? It says you should know what you're saying here. This is obvious. It's obvious how this is dealt with. We don't confront it. Sorry, Bilo. It was
Bilo's time. Let's just say from Bilo. Also, the committees in Parliament, especially where finance is concerned, have been sort of a clearinghouse. When you're talking about budgeted, estimates that come to their table, this is supposed to be 100 billion. It costs now 200 billion. Is there a way that these clearing houses, they are also compromised so that they're blind? They're blinded by it, they don't see it, they don't question it, it just passes this.
You see, the era of the independence of Parliament, when the backbench used to call the shots, was in the 19th century. Since the discipline, party loyalty thing came in, people belongs to political parties. It's been difficult for Parliament, particularly chairs of committees who are appointed courtesy of the executive, to exercise that free mandate in terms of their oversight. And so you'll find then in the National Assembly, when a budget is done or when these things are being approved, the members of Parliament would toe the official line of the executive, and they will approve this thing because the executive wants it. A good example I'll give you was the SGR. SGR was contested so much, by many members of Parliament and by the media and in the public. But the committee was, prevailed upon by the executive to endorse it. The same thing with the laptop project. Remember the Galana project. All of these things which took a lot of money during the last 10 years, remember. And it's not just pressure applied because of a political party affiliation. Sometimes it's payment of money. The executive actually bribes members of Parliament to approve some of these things, and it has been published many times in the media. That they're particularly the budget. There was a time we debated in Senate. I remember 2016 or 17. It's a headline story when members of Parliament, Parliament Budget Committee, and I have said this again in these forums before, were bribed by the Treasury to approve, certain budgets, and they were getting, paid. This is what happens. So there are a lot of. You live in a country where integrity is always in question, and so some of these things are done, knowingly. Others are done when you are not necessarily in the picture, when you are not an expert on finance, and these things are put in there. You see, the government wants to give you money. For example, you want to borrow to put up your factory. You apply for a loan you want to get funding from European Investment Bank or some place. These things can be arranged for you through some Kenya commercial bank or through some other state bank, and you'll get that loan, and it's organized. These things get charged one way or the other to government either through guarantee or through and sovereign guarantees are very important, by the way. This is what they told you. You see, the reason why you have to pay your loans as a country is because a sovereign guarantee you cannot run away.
It's a sovereign guarantee, right?
They will do what they did to Russia, during the war in Ukraine. All the international payment system, everything you rely on is can be frozen. If you don't, so you have to, once your guys have signed the dotted lines, and so I think the challenge is, unless executive really respects Parliament and submits every proposal for a loan to Parliament for approval, then it becomes very difficult. It becomes very difficult for us.
So that
to
debate
know what
about defaulting as an option is a dangerous debate.
Yes, because you lose your sovereignty.
Indeed.
But I want, instead of Parliament, I want to challenge the opposition. I want to challenge the opposition.
All these three were in Parliament, so let's listen.
Yes, and
They are all
because
parliamentary.
I feel very proud that the 8th Parliament, 1997, the 19th he was talking about, was a real parliament. But that notwithstanding, my challenge to Azimio is that if they really, maybe this is where they should come hard on government.
Yeah.
Insist on auditing this public debt, especially if they're not culpable. I know they're part of a previous administration.
Yeah.
But even if they are, instead of this window dressing, they are telling Kenyans, let them come out and insist. Maybe what Okia Mtata and Jimmy are doing, perhaps the coast should direct, instead of us even forming this Sakaola Commission of Inquiry, if anything deserves having a commission of inquiry. We're talking of trillions of Kenya shillings the BAL. It's not pocket change. So I think this is an area.
But don't downplay Shakahola, please.
If we have, no, I'm just saying that maybe they're both important, but
Yes.
1.5 trillion shillings is not pocket change, Mheshimiwa.
No, it isn't.
Let's go deep, dig deep into it and get to the bottom of it. Even if we need to have a national reconciliation and all that with it, but let's get to know exactly what's happening.
But the commission of inquiry has been done before for the Golden Bag. We've never known any report that really came out from there. So what do you think this will make?
Well,
None.
at the very
at the end of the
minimum,
day.
in line with the Freedom of Information Act, at the very minimum, Kenyans, it goes to the court of public opinion. So people, the very minimum, Kenyans get to know.
Did you hear
But-
what Professor Gituro Wanaina said in the beginning, that government is either a what?
It's an elephant or a chameleon.
Or a chameleon.
Yeah.
So, but
you
I wanted-
drag with it.
They
with a
will
light
drag it
touch,
until
you drag
you're
until
fatigued with that
the
particular
talk
story.
of State House entertaining dignitaries at 8.5 million shillings a day, I wanted to compliment, of course, divine intervention is important. I'm not sure they need to consume 8.5 shillings million
Why
a
do
day.
why do you need divine intervention? What wrong are you doing?
But if you can protect me now from my good professor, I think the dignitaries, I think one area I wanted to compliment the president on is trying to revive the Pan-African spirit, that getting to entertain, whether it's leadership from Djibouti or Nigeria, wherever it is, I think is a right way to go, to the extent that some civil societies, African AU civil societies, are beginning to say, are we seeing a new Muammar Gaddafi coming up? I think to that extent we need to complement. Kenya opening ways for Djiboutians to come in and vice versa is something that needs to be done. But I'm hoping that you can allow us at some point.
But at the expense of...
Oh my God.
Or-
I don't know
or
what's
of a
happening
taxpayer.
today. You are saying there is a Gaddafi appearing somewhere in Tambo somebody?
If I'm allowed to elaborate more.
you better start on benevolence.
I want to go and
would
buy
say
coffee.
the
I want to
other
buy a
one.
beer coffee.
Not only benevolence, the BAL, to be fair to President Ruto, you know, when he comes out on behalf of African heads of states and says, this thing of parading 50 African heads of states by one president is really not right. I think that's commendable. If he comes out and says Kenya, and maybe building upon what President Kenyatta did, of opening doors saying Africans who want to come to Kenya can get their visas on arrival, and we continue doing that, that's commendable. When he negotiates with South Africa and say there's reciprocity in terms of visas to South Africa for Kenyans and vice versa, I think that's the kind of thing I'm saying, that that's Pan-African spirit, that's commendable. But that's notwithstanding, I have concerns that if we were to promote that spirit, particularly if you allowed the diaspora part, these guys are bringing trillions of shillings we are talking about, but we are not bothering to create sufficient attention. The entire world currently is in Nairobi, that's in the remittance space. The government seems just to be paying lip service. I would have expected government to do much more. I would have been so proud if at very high level of government, they embraced the world that decided to come to Kenya and Sub-Saharan Africa for the first time to discuss remittances. Very serious business. But then in that meeting, the outgoing governor of the central bank, this was publicly said. He said he reassured the peers of diaspora affairs that within a month there'll be a diaspora bond. Okay, that's probably more borrowing. But then, are we also going to make the same mistake of the past? You come up with products for diaspora, you think they'll buy into it without involving them the bulk. So I'm hoping at some point you could allow us to discuss what's happening currently in our country. In fact, in the discussions at the UN, people are saying there are avenues to increase remittances to by $100 billion to the world if ABCD are done. But Kenya, which is hosting it, is almost absent in that conversation.
Is there any budget dedicated to the diaspora affairs? I've not been really keen to look at the diaspora affairs also within this particular budget. You've not seen any?
I may even ask what results are there. You know, we are almost 9 months into a government. You know, they say within 9 months after a wedding or marriage, people start seeing signs. Maybe there is a bouncing baby or something. So we need to be seeing.
but those are the avenues. And 2 weeks ago, I was in Addis, and I was not sure whether I wanted to come back. But you talk about the diaspora for other reasons.
Tell us why.
Yeah, tell the reason why I didn't want to come back. Right. And you look kind of the investment they have really done, like the dam. Yeah. There are opportunities there. And you asked about the 3% levy, isn't it? And I just want to read something here, very interesting, by this guy called Arias Mkoa. And he says...
this is in the Standard.
Yeah, the March talked about 3% housing levy is impractical in the way it is presented as if it will benefit everyone, when the truth it will not. Moreover, it is not the most offending article, yet it's primed as the mother of all the solutions in the bill. So there are things here you try to unpack here. And that's what I'm saying, if diaspora perhaps could be a better avenue or opportunity for raising in terms of like the housing levy.
Right.
So that's the kind of thinking I think Shem is bringing on the table.
Right.
Here we have, how do we package these guys to invest more in the country? Yeah. And the other areas where we can do that, than really, really taxing people.
Right.
And the question you brought, Bill, very important in the sovereign debt. If this has not been sanctioned by Parliament, and Jimmy Wanjigi was coming very strongly, saying Ruto should not sign. Because the moment he signs, he commits himself to an illegality. Now, it's very important here to distinguish being theoretical and being practical. It's very good in theory to say you are going to an illegality. Practically, they'll go ahead and sign it. Yeah? What the heck? The issue of whether we have overpaid, I don't know. And I don't want to venture in things you don't have data. As the senator and Jimmy are saying we have overpaid our
it's all right. You see, if you just need to think back a year ago when Thuge and Rotich were charged in court for the Kimberley dam thing. Look at that story of that dam, how the payments were made. It was all in the public media. That Italian company was being paid, the contractor was being paid, and another financier also from same, out there. And, before even the mobilization was done, huge amounts of money, billions, have been paid. This is the way these loans are being done. It's not like money going to your the typical loan that you and me take. This is, payments are made, no work has been done. That's why the loan becomes then
fast forward. Next week, Duga is in Central Bank.
Say that again. So you'll actually, when you look through the register, by the way, when you look through the register, the loan register is there. When you go to the website, you'll see in Treasury, some of the figures are there. But you'll find, if you're trying to relate a particular loan in that register to a project which has happened in his backyard, you'll find it very difficult, because you'll see actually that 500 million loan has been given for a road point A to B in location so and so, and you'll probably realize that that location and there's no road that has been done. But the transaction has been done, the loan has been given, Treasury has used it to pay salaries or whatever, or someone else has been paid off, a contractor was paid, he never went to site. Whatever has happened, but that's the kind of situation where we are in. We have huge loans, but there's nothing.
And the way to crack at it is the OAG must be a strong office.
Just my music is up right now, indicating that I should be taking a station break right now. When we circle back, we get clarity. Earlier on, we had Bill Okero talking about the housing levy, which was touted to be good as a contribution and not as a tax. But now, with the consensus from the Finance Committee, it is labeled as a levy, not as a levy, but as a tax. And this is a cartoon that we just had previously there that was showing. We want to come back with this particular issue of housing levy. Now that we have it as a tax, what are the